Thank you all for joining. My name is Renee. I'm the project manager of the CalMatters for Learning program. And today we are discussing renters' rights and eviction protections within California. This is part of a monthly series that we have in partnership with the California State Libraries. And you can find additional resources on every topic that we do every month at calmatters.org/forlearning. I can put that in the chat later as well. But for now, we have two exciting speakers who are going to talk to us. They're experts in the field, and they'll be able to talk to us more about this topic. So I'm going to pass it over to Richard.
Hello. So happy you could join us. I don't know if we're exciting. We may have been oversold a bit, but we're delighted to have you with us. My name is Richard. I'm the Housing and Homelessness and Economy Editor at CalMatters. I'm joined by Ben Christopher, who has covered a wide variety of things for us, but is currently our housing reporter. And I'm going to start us off with some news you can use, hopefully, about renters' rights and evictions. And then toward the end, we'll get into sort of maybe what's going on with renters' rights right now, as far as what the state is doing about housing. And if we have time toward the end, we'll get into some reader questions. Okay. So also something I want to mention at the top is that everywhere I've worked, the housing and homelessness and real estate reporters get a ton of questions from readers about their situations. And so I think this is useful to say that like a lot of housing and renter and eviction law is somewhat specific to the locality that you're in. And so it's often hard for the reporter to give you the answer you seek. But today we'll try and give you some resources that you can reach out to get the answer to those questions, because we really do want to help. Okay, so Ben, good morning.
Good morning.
What is the good news for California renters?
Boy, you don't hear about renting in California and good news usually, but I would say the good news for California renters in general, and I appreciate the caveat that you put at top, which is that a lot of this really does depend on where you are. But statewide, we actually have a number of blanket protections and rights in place for renters and responsibilities imposed on landlords that a lot of other states don't. And those kind of provide a sort of baseline off of which some local governments will be able to make adjustments in some cases, not in always. And so maybe the most obvious place to start is with the actual rent increases that are allowed. There is what's called a statewide rent cap. It's also, people throw around the term rent stabilization policy, rent control. They call it rent cap because it's kind of a high level, broad cap that says how much landlords can raise the rent each year. And it's set right now, kind of a complicated formula, but it's basically 10%. So landlords cannot hike the rent year over year more than 10%. And it can be lower depending on the current rate of inflation. So if inflation, the formula is it can either be 5% plus the rate of inflation or 10%, whichever is lower. So if inflation is 3%, then that's 3 plus 5. So the max would be 8%. If, like we saw the last couple of years, inflation is a bit higher, say it's 7%, then 7 plus 5 is 12, but then you're capped at 10. So it's never going to be over 10, but it could be under 10 is the way to think about it.
Okay.
Obviously, 10% is still a lot, or 8% or whatever it is. And so there are folks clamoring for laws to sort of bring that cap down. And again, if you're living in a place like San Francisco, LA, Berkeley, a lot of sort of the big coastal cities, there may be additional local restrictions that are even tighter. There are also a number of just general rights aside from the level of rent, or rights that are afforded to tenants. So in terms of setting limits on some of the fees that you have to pay or the security deposits that are required. There's also what's called a just cause eviction protection rule. And just cause as in like rightful cause, not like just cause we can evict, but like just as in just righteous or reasonable, a rationale for. So you can't just evict someone for any old reason, which is the case in some states. In California, you have to have what's considered a just cause, and we can kind of talk about what those are. Um, and
Okay.
do you want to do that now, or should we do?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about what that means for people.
Okay. So basically, just cause, you can kind of break it down in two reasons why you might get evicted. There's sort of at fault eviction, meaning that the tenant did something or didn't do something that is triggering that eviction. They might not actually be at fault, but that's the legal term. Or no fault eviction, meaning it's something that the landlord is doing. So the at fault, the most obvious one and probably the most common one, although the data out is kind of sparse, is failure to pay. So if you are a renter and you're not paying the rent for a period of time, then you can get evicted. And that's why I kind of like to put at fault in quotes, because obviously if you can't pay, it might be through no fault of your own. If you're a tenant, you maybe lose your job or some other kind of major expense comes along and you can't pay the rent. But that's under the law. The landlord is entitled to evict you if you are not paying your rent. And then there are some other what's considered like material change or violations of your lease. So if your lease says like, hey, you can't have I don't know, a roommate, or you can't do remodeling, or you can't, some major violation of the lease, then I don't know if material is the term that's in the law. And so I don't think it's not like a minor thing. Like if, the page 7 of your lease on, subsection 6, part D says you can't have a hammock and you have a hammock in the backyard. You can't really get evicted over that. But if it's like it's a major thing that actually costs the landlord something, you can get evicted over that. And then there's some like big obvious ones, like if you're committing crimes in your apartment, you can get evicted for that. If you're causing some kind of disturbance, like blasting music at all hours, or if you're smoking when it says you can't smoke, you can get evicted for that. So that's the sort of the at fault section
Okay.
of evictions. And then there's the no fault, which is a little bit in some ways it's a little bit scarier for the tenant because it's sort of out of their control. But also in a lot of cases, you are afforded more rights. So that would be something like the landlord doesn't want to be a landlord anymore, and they decide they want to just take the property back and sell it, or they want to convert it into a commercial property or something, then you can be evicted for that. You could also, if they want to move in, or if their family member wants to move in, there's also a major remodel or renovation. So if they're going to completely gut the house to redo all the kitchen and do all the wiring and stuff, then they can evict you for that. The good news, if you're a tenant in that situation, is that you get a longer notification period. So the landlord under California law, and again, it might vary by your local, you might have more time at the local level, but under California law, you're given 60 days before they can evict you. And then there's going to be a relocation fee
Okay.
that they have to pay you. So they have to give you at least 1 month's rent, or not have you pay the rent for the last month. And again, in some local government, local areas like LA and San Francisco, there's significantly more. So in those no fault cases, you should, if you're a tenant in that situation, you should really make sure that you are aware of what you are entitled to in that situation.
Sure.
Because obviously it's expensive to move, it's expensive to find a new place, particularly if you're in an area where you're paying sort of a below market rate, and then all of a sudden you have to find something on the market that can be really expensive. And so making sure that you're availing yourself of your rights in that case is like a good idea.
So generally, the rights protecting renters in California relative to the rest of the union are strong.
Yes. I don't know if I can say like categorically that they're like the strongest, but that's the
Sure.
vibe. At least, that's my sense, that they're much stronger than your average state. So again, there's the rent cap, there's the just cause protections, there are certain other limits and on fees and so forth. There's the relocation payment at the state level. Um, Recent law means that if you are getting evicted, you have a little bit more time to respond. And then again, if you're looking at the local, depending on where you live. So I think the last I checked, I think it was 39 cities across the state, or jurisdictions, because I think there's some counties in there too, have additional rent rent control or rent stabilization policies that are lower than the state rent cap.
Right.
And that doesn't sound like a lot because there are over 450 cities. There are a lot
There's
of
a
cities
lot.
in California, but those are the big ones. So it's like LA, San Francisco, Oakland. Those have some, so it's a significant portion of the population, if you're a renter in California, have these additional protections. And then there are also cities like San Diego, they don't have a rent control ordinance, but they do have a just cause ordinance in place. So there are additional protections there. So that's, I guess, to answer your first question, that's the good news.
That's the good news.
That's
All
the
right. Great segue. What's the bad news, Ben?
The bad news is that you are a renter in California, and California is really expensive. So, it depends on sort of how you count it, but like among the most expensive states if you're a renter, maybe second to Hawaii, depending on what you're counting. But we're definitely up there as like, I don't think you need a statistic to prove that. Like if you're a renter, it's very expensive to live here, if you're a renter. And then I guess the other bad news is that on the eviction front, you can still get evicted. There's still we kind of talked through some of the ways in which you can get evicted. There's the non-payment. So again, that's the sort of the leading at fault cause for eviction is that you can't pay, and that's often not a tenant's fault. They lose a job, they don't have the money, they can't pay, and there's not much of a legal recourse there, right? If you're a landlord, you are entitled to get paid for the property that you're renting, and so there.
And as we've written about, there are even instances where if you come up with the money as the renter, the landlord can still proceed with a non-payment eviction.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. So even if you are behind on your rent and then you come back to your landlord 2 months later and say, "Hey, here's all my back rent," they can say, "Thanks very much for the money. You're still evicted." Just simply for not paying on time, you're breaking the lease in a material way. There was a pause to this policy during COVID and for 2 year and a half, 2 years after that, where for public health reasons, there was sort of a moratorium on evictions for non-payment because they didn't want a bunch of people flooding out into shelters or into other congregate living facilities during a global health pandemic, but those have been phased out. There were also, this might get into some of the questions that people have, but there were public support programs to help people make that back rent during the pandemic. Most of those have been phased out. I believe San Francisco still has a local one. There may be others, but for the most part, you can't pay your rent. That's kind of it. There isn't much.
Yeah.
Um, and then again, we talked about the no fault eviction. So the remodeling, the landlord wants to go out of business. The landlord wants to have a property for their mother. There's not much you can do about that. You are entitled to certain protections. Again, you get more notice, you get the relocation payment, so forth. But you can't just say, "No, I'm not leaving." And so there is even if you are in California with the stronger protections, you don't have the security that it's not a total sense of security, I guess.
Right.
And then I think a big caveat is that these protections that we've been talking about don't apply to all renters. And they don't apply equally to all renters. So short-term rentals, if you're renting for less than a year, often these protections don't apply to you, or they don't apply to you in full. If you're living in a newer building, so something built in the last 15 years, the rent cap doesn't apply to you. If you're living in most single-family homes, for whatever reason, the rent cap does not apply to you. We can talk about the strange politics of that, but for the most part in California, most rentals are multifamily housing, so like apartment buildings, and most owner-occupied buildings are single-family homes. But there is some crossover. So there are some single-family rentals, and you are not protected in those. Um,
I'll also add that another bad thing for renters, and this isn't California specific, this is just true of renters, is that you are somewhat at the mercy of people that have more power than you. We reported during COVID how sheriffs were continuing to perform evictions even though they weren't supposed to. And so it's very possible that you're in a situation where someone above you is doing something they're not supposed to, and you're still on the hook for those actions, which is unfortunate but true.
yeah, I mean, almost by definition, landlords have more financial and maybe political clout than tenants. I think the places where you see these strong tenant protections are places where, um, for whatever reason, there are a lot of well-to-do renters. So San Francisco is one of the few places in the country where like doctors and lawyers are renting regularly. And so as a result, perhaps you see really strong rent protections. Not to be too cynical about it, but I think that's got to play a part.
Absolutely.
But yeah, if you're not living in those areas, you may not have local protections in place. You may not have many local resources in place to help you out, and you may just not have the wherewithal to sort of. I mean, the stuff is really complicated. I follow this
Right.
for a living, and I find that I have a hard time keeping track of all the different laws and what the rights
Yes.
are and under what conditions certain protections are in place. And so, if you're in a position where you're being evicted, almost by definition, you're not in a great you're facing a lot of stress. You might have a lot of financial stresses, you might have a lot of other life stressors, and so you're not like in a great position to become your own lawyer and
Mhm.
or policy analyst and figure out exactly what you're entitled to. So that's why, again, if you're watching this because you are facing eviction, I would really suggest not to turn to someone like me who's not a lawyer, but to get legal assistance. And so,
Well, that's great because that's our next question
okay,
is Ben, I'm so sorry to inform you, you've just been evicted.
yeah.
What would you do in this situation?
Yeah. So first, I would close the Zoom video, stop listening to me. I would go
Yeah.
get legal help. There are a lot of websites out there that will offer you legal assistance. There are a lot of legal aid groups that provide discounted or free legal advice to tenants. The one that is actually recommended by the state of California, so it's sort of the semi-official one, is lawhelpca.org. So if you are in this position, lawhelpca.org would be the one, and then you can kind of plug in your address, and it'll give you a list of legal aid organizations that might be able to help you navigate that. So first off, like talk to someone who actually knows the law, and then who also knows the law in your area, because again, as we've been saying, a lot of it really varies. Um, but yeah, if I'm being evicted, what do I do? It really depends on the nature of the eviction. So again, if it's like if I'm getting evicted because I decided to do an unpermitted remodel of the kitchen, uh, that's an at-fault eviction. I don't really have a lot of recourse there. So I'm going to be getting a notice, and it says like, 3-day quit notice, and I have to be out in 3 days, and that's kind of it. Um, and again, it also kind of depends on where you live. But it's also kind of important, I think, to know the steps of the process and when it is that you are actually evicted. So if your landlord says, "Hey, I'm evicting you," you have not been evicted. If the landlord gives you a notice and it says you have 3 days to pay or quit, or you 3 days to leave, or 5 days to leave, or 30 days to leave, you've still not been evicted. If once that period passes, you get an eviction notice, um, a summons to go to court, you've still not been evicted. You have not been evicted until a court says you've been evicted. A sheriff is coming to your house. A sheriff comes to your house and says you have to leave. So
And wait, let's go over that again because I think that's not intuitive for people. I think most people would say, "Oh, I got this thing that's saying I have to go in X days. Oh, I've been evicted." No, that isn't the case.
right. So if you get a 3-day pay or quit notice, for example, that's the one that says like pay me money that you owe or leave, and then the 3 days pass. What that means is that eviction proceedings can begin. So it doesn't mean you're
Okay.
evicted. It means that okay, now the in this case the landlord has given you notice, that he's given you the chance to pay, and you haven't done it, and so now they have the right to start requesting from a court the right to kick you out of the house or the apartment. But that's the beginning of the process. That's not the end of it. And so I just say that because particularly if you don't really know the law, you might hear from a landlord, get that notice that looks scary and formal, and say like, "Oh, I got to start packing my bags." Don't leave until you have to.
Right.
If for no other reason that you have more time to look for a new place to live, you have more time to get legal resources, you have more time to sort of figure out your situation. Even if you think you're going to lose, even if you don't plan to fight it, don't self-evict. Wait until you're actually like the sheriff is at your door. I would say. If a landlord is watching this, they might not like be saying that, but this is your legal right. Uh,
Well, and I'll say, we are nonpartisan. We are not anti-landlord by any means, but it is also true that a lot of this stuff, landlords don't communicate to the tenants because it's not in their interest to communicate. If they give someone an eviction notice, it's because they want that person out. So they aren't, in almost every case, going to tell them like, okay, you're not technically evicted yet. We just want to start that.
Yeah. 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 And, you know, the state law provides rights and responsibilities to landlords. It provides rights and responsibilities to tenants. It's important for both sides to know them. And there are lots of organizations out there that are good at providing that information to landlords, fewer for tenants. So
Yes.
that's why we're having this conversation. So yeah, I guess just to summarize, like get legal help, know what stage of the process you're in and sort of what your responsibilities are. And you know, I don't know if it's reasonable and safe to do so, like just keep communicating with your landlord so that you know you kind of know where you are in the process if possible. But again, I think just like Paramount, get legal assistance and know that the landlord can't, like if you come home and the landlord says, I changed your locks, you're evicted, that's illegal. You've not been evicted. Your landlord has illegally locked you out of your apartment. So,
Yes.
sorry, I shouldn't laugh because this happens. Um, but yeah, it's just important to sort of know where your rights are. But again, plug for lawhelpca.org.
Yes. Lawhelpca.org. And I will say generally, I can't guarantee this. Again, it depends on where you are, but there are often tenant advocacy groups or tenants unions that will help get you legal aid, even if you can't afford it, be it a pro bono lawyer or something. So don't hear the words "get a lawyer" and assume that you can't get one. There are people that want to help. Okay, so to this end, a new law went into effect in January
Mhm.
that helps renters specifically with eviction notices. Ben, can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So again, kind of going back to the process, you get your notice to remedy the situation or whatever, like your pay or quit notice, or your 3-day notice, or your 5-day notice, or your 30-day notice. Um, and then under the law, you have a certain amount of time. Once you get the eviction summons from the court, you have a certain amount of time to respond to that. Up until last year, it was 5 days. Current law, the law that you were talking about in January, gives you 10 days to respond to that eviction summons. And that's really important because under the law, if you don't respond or if you don't respond in time, you forfeit your right to contest the eviction. So basically, you had a lot of situations where someone would get a notice, they wouldn't really know what to do. They'd call some friends, they'd call some family members, they'd dwell on it, they'd reach out to the landlord. 5 days would go by, and then they would have no right to fight the eviction. They would eventually, you know, there would still be a legal process to go through, but by the end of it, the judge would say, like, you didn't fight, so I'm siding with the landlord. End of story, you're evicted. So the 10 days, it's, you know, it's a doubling of the amount of time that you have if you were being evicted to respond. And again, that would be a good time to reach out to a lawyer because you can respond yourself, but like I'm not going to suggest you do that.
And what does a response look like literally?
Um, so my understanding of it is that you can either the petition that the landlord presents to the court says like, here are the reasons that I'm evicting this person. If it's an at fault thing, like here are the things that they did that weren't under the law. Give me that give me the right as a landlord to evict them. And then your response is saying, going item by item, saying I either can deny that this is the case, or I'm going to defend myself because there's some other condition that would give me the right to do that, or whatever it is. It's basically it's your ability as a tenant to respond to what the landlord is telling the court you did. And
Sure.
so it's a very important step of the process because again, if you don't respond, by default, the judge has to say, okay, we only heard from one side and we defer to them. And so the eviction goes forward.
Um, okay, and so we've covered a lot, but is there anything else that you think it's important for someone facing eviction to be aware of?
Um, Again, I've said this like 8 times, but get a lawyer, go to lawhelp.ca.org. And also just again, worth stressing, like know your rights, know that eviction isn't final until it's final. Don't self-evict yourself. Know that a scary official notice that says eviction on it or says pay or quit it's not does not mean you're being evicted yet. And so yeah, that's
But I would emphasize it's very important to show up to court,
yeah,
because if you don't show up, it's much easier for or slash definitely goes against you.
default. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, going back to that 10 days, like make sure that you respond within those 10 days, either with a lawyer or without. And then if you are summoned to a court to actually show up, like do that.
And it's important to show up even if you don't have a lawyer, if you don't wish to
Yes.
be evicted.
Yeah.
So even if you haven't managed to find a lawyer in that time, still go to the court date.
Yep.
Uh, okay. And at the top, I mentioned there's some news about rent caps that has just happened. So what is that? What just occurred?
Breaking news. Yeah. So I mentioned that there is this law in place statewide, the rent cap. That's the 10% cap or inflation plus 5%. There, and I also mentioned that a lot of tenant rights advocates have argued that 10% is still too high.
Mhm.
And so they wanted to lower it. And so going into this discussion, prepared to speak about a certain bill, AB 1157 for those watching at home, that would have cut that cap in half. It would have brought it down to 5% or 2% plus inflation. And it had just passed a key committee hearing and was going forward. There was a lot of arguments on both sides, as you can imagine, with tenant rights really advocates really pushing for it, landlords and sort of the landlord lobby really obviously against it. But as of this morning, this is April 29th, it's 11:30 right now, so around 9 o'clock this morning, we got a notice that the author of that bill, Ash Colroy, is an assembly member from the San Jose area, decided to pull the bill, meaning it will not be heard this year, because he didn't think he had the requisite support to get it through. So so that's the news, which is that actually the law is not changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna very briefly try and get to like one or two reader questions that people sent us. Um, I think these are separate questions. Okay, so my husband and I are seniors over 65. Does this give us special protections as far as eviction goes? I don't think so. Ben, do you know?
So it actually depends on where you live.
Okay.
There are certain jurisdictions, I believe LA is one of them, where there are certain protected classes, where you are entitled either to additional protections, or I think in LA it's you're entitled to additional relocation assistance. So if you're being evicted for no fault, you're entitled to your state level of relocation assistance, which is about a month, which is a month of pay. And then I think LA has an additional formula, which is very complicated based on your income and whether you fall into these protected classes. And in LA, I actually honestly can't remember if it's 60 or 65. So again, another reason to really to look into sort of what your
Yeah, I would find a tenants advocates group in your town or city and ask them. But yeah, because like Ben and I have been covering this for 10 years plus each, and it's hard to know. Um, I'm currently renting with no lease. I had a lease the first year of my tenancy, then was told none was needed. Is this standard practice in California? I was told it was. Does this make me more vulnerable to eviction? So I can't speak to California as a state. I can tell you I've been renting in San Francisco for a number of years, and it is relatively standard in San Francisco to sign a 1-year lease and then you default to month. And San Francisco has fairly strong tenant protections. I don't know if that is standard practice in other California cities.
Gosh, I've never actually come across that question, so I'm not entirely sure either. Although, again, my history as a renter, also in the Bay Area, similar. It's you do your 1 year and then month to month. But it's a good question whether that's. I never
Yeah.
questioned whether that was a common Bay Area practice or a common California.
Well, I'll say it was It struck me as odd at first too, because I previously rented in Davis and New York, and both of those places you need to sign another year lease. And so I would say at least where you default to month after that, it is actually in favor of the renter because it gives you more flexibility if you have to move. I don't think it makes you more vulnerable, but again, check with a lawyer. Okay, sorry, we'll do one more. I know we're at time, but we'll try and do one more. If owners sell rental property to new owners who want to live in it, what are eviction rules? Does the owner have to give me advance notice?
Yep.
How long can I stay in the house once it's sold? Do I have the right of first refusal to buy the house?
So that would be a no-fault eviction. That's one of the permissible categories where the renter, the landlord is deciding they don't want to be a landlord anymore. They want to sell the property. And so you're entitled to 60 days notice, at least. That's the statewide rule. There may be additional protections at the local level. I keep saying that. Sorry, kind of a broken record there. And then in terms of how long you can stay after the sale, I mean, once you get your 60-day notice, then you have 60 days. So I don't think that varies based on when the sale takes place. But again, if you're concerned that your rights are being violated here, reach out to a lawyer.
Yeah, we are not giving legal advice, to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also a good question about if you have right of first refusal to buy the house. I don't think so, but again,
There's some city ordinances that have tried to provide a right of first refusal to sort of nonprofit affordable developers or tenant groups, but probably not where you live. But again, talk to your lawyer.
and the owner does need to give you notice. They'll give you the
Yeah,
60-day or
absolutely.
more notice. Like they cannot show up in the middle of the night and kick you out.
Yeah, again, that's worth stressing. Under no circumstances can someone get evicted without notice. Like even if you were lighting your apartment on fire, they still have
Yeah,
to come in, put out the fire, and then give you 3 days.
yeah.
So
Okay.
don't
Renee, we've
don't light
technically
your
run.
apartment on fire though. That's not a recommendation.
Yeah. So do not commit arson, please.
Yeah.
Um,
Also, again, I've been stressing that you should reach out to a lawyer, but if you have a specific question or want to reach out to a housing reporter for whatever reason, I'm at ben@calmatters.org. Happy to try and help, or again, yeah, point you in the right direction.
I am Richard at CalMatters.org. I am happy to send your email to Ben.
Thanks, Richard.
Awesome. I think we're at time. So thank you both for that great discussion. And that's all we got today. Anything else you guys want to add at all?
That's it. Thanks so much for organizing this. Thanks to everyone who came and watched along.
I would just put in a plug for like we really do try to cover everything about housing in California from renters on up. So if you have a tip, send it our way. If you just want to be very informed, keep reading us and also support your local library.
Thank you.